Hi everybody, it's Josh. I'm here with Viviana, and we're here to talk about part of the Skillful Teacher from Day 3 on relationships. And Viv, when I was in some of the lunch meetings after your presentation, a bunch of teachers remarked on how the resource that you shared was really helpful in them kind of taking their effective effort to the next level because of the way that you separated it into different learning styles. So I'd love for you to share kind of a little bit about what you told the group, and we'll start with the PowerPoint and then go on to the resource, and hopefully you can just kind of give us a hint about how you set it up and why. So we'll start here with the mastery objective.
Sure. This section was all about how we can use the relationships with our students to leverage increased student learning. And so the objective that comes out of this particular section was about getting teachers to identify additional moves or strategies they can add to their repertoires to help students improve their ability to push their effective effort. And in order to know which aspect or which pieces from our repertoire we can use, that's where the student relationships come in. So let's start by telling a little story about some of my former students.
Great.
So these are my two former students. That's Karunya on the right and Maya on the left. And both of these were two girls in my A-Push class. And in every single way, they were probably the ideal students. They were enthusiastic, they asked a lot of questions, they participated, they were great in working with groups and alone, and they were really interested in the content. They were taking the AP course because they loved history. And I learned something from working with them that I hadn't realized in my prior teaching. Before I had built this relationship with these two girls in AP US history, I would have students that would come up to me and tell me that they needed help with their performance in class, and I would often ask really standardized questions. Did you do the reading? Yes or no? Are you using the guiding questions? Yes or no? Are you looking at your notes? And then usually that would be the extent of it, and I would tell the students, well, read it a second time, or spend more time with your notes.
Try harder.
Try harder, exactly. And I never knew whether or not any of those things were helpful. The students usually just kind of went away, didn't come back. With Maya and Karunya, though, what I learned is that because I had a relationship with them and knew them very well as people and as learners, I was able to give them much more specific advice and much more specific strategies that they could use.
So what kind of advice did you give them?
So, for example, Karunya was very, very high energy, definitely liked to be up and around and moving. She was very social, liked to talk to people, and I noticed just in her life and in her notes that color was very important to her, and it was something that helped her make meaning and sense of things. So with her, what we did is we created a couple different strategies that would go to those strengths. So we talked about having her work in groups. She created a study group with some friends so she could talk through making meaning, which was really helpful. Because she was really active, energetic, I figured she could be kind of kinesthetic. And so what we did is we took the idea of like word webs or concept mapping, and we had her put concepts, words, people on note cards, and she would create the concept maps on the ground so she could literally walk through history and make sense of it.
Did you come up with these ideas ahead of time or kind of in conversation with them?
In conversation. I sort of looked at her and said, hey, I noticed you have a lot of color. Have you thought about, color coding a timeline? Or I noticed that you like to stand up and move around. Do you have a lot of floor space in your room? Have you ever tried concept mapping? And she sort of put the two together. So we created a plan for her. Whereas for Maya, she was much more of a linear thinker. While she was okay doing group work, she really preferred to do a lot of the studying on her own. And so what we did with her is we decided, maybe she could try doing some timelines where she created one timeline on legislation, one timeline on cultural shifts, things like that. And then she also would go through a color code because color coding seemed like something that would help her as well. But she really preferred to be able to create a very linear process to be able to use her studying. So both of them were already doing the reading. They already were taking really good notes, but they needed to figure out what was the next step.
So these were strategies they had never tried before.
They had never tried before. And what we found is some of them worked and some of them didn't, but in both cases the students' scores on their next unit test increased, even though they were spending pretty much the same amount of time studying, but these strategies were much better matches to their strengths, and so their learning increased significantly.
So you had said that, because this was part of the relationships day, that it's your relationship with them that allowed you to kind of fine-tune.
Right.
But also it sounds like before, even if you had relationships, you weren't necessarily thinking about them as individual learners and more suggesting kind of general study strategies.
Exactly.
Do flashcards, even if flashcards wasn't for them.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
So let's go on to kind of how you summarized for the group in the Skillful Teacher, and then we'll share the resource as well.
Sure. So the whole idea that we were putting together here is that I already had really good relationships with my students, but I wasn't using them in the best way to help them to learn. And what really that comes down to is making sure that I can help students to understand effective effort and guide and coach them in using effective effort. So one thing that we know about effective effort is that the way that students get better, the way that they grow, is by practicing deliberately and well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was encouraging students to practice, but I wasn't helping them to figure out how to do that well.
Mm-hmm.
It's also about using their strengths to improve their areas of growth. So if some students have issues with, sure, if some students have issues with reading comprehension, that would be a different kind of strategy that we're using than if what they're having trouble with is making sense of overarching concepts. And so we needed to figure out how to use the strengths that they do have in learning to help with the areas of growth that they're struggling with. And so in order to best help students, we need two different things. One is a repertoire of tools, resources, and strategies. In the story that I told, some of them came from ideas that I had used in my own studying, some of them came from the students, and some of them we made up together. And then the second thing we need is matching. So even though I know about concept maps, if I don't know if a student is a linear thinker or conceptual thinker, then I might not know which tool would be the best one to use.
I love that because repertoire and matching are two of the core concepts for the course, so I appreciate you putting those in there. Okay, let's go on to the actual document. So this can be found in the Skillful Teacher folder under Course Resources for Day 3. Just to kind of give everybody an overview, it's a 3-page document, and then each page of it has the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning styles. So Viv, why don't you kind of take us through how they can teacher might use this as a resource?
Sure. So first thing that I want to point out is that the majority of the strategies on this sheet actually came from my students. After I had this experience with Karunya and Maya, what I did is I asked every single one of my students to fill out a survey saying what kinds of study strategies they were already using, and then that was how I helped to build my repertoire. And so this document is a result of that and some other things that I picked up along the way. They're organized into learning styles because I think that's something that teachers already have a very strong understanding of. They can, if they know their students, they can tell sort of what kind of learning style each student would have. I do want to point out, though, that it's organized this way for ease of use, but it's really important that when we look at our students, we realize that we can't sort of pigeonhole them into one specific kind of learning style, and that in order for the best kind of learning to occur, they need to use multiple strategies from multiple types of learning styles in order for them to have the best opportunity.
And that's supported, obviously, by, a lot of brain research that just shows how it goes. The information has to go across different regions of the brain. I also think it's interesting because calling yourself a visual learner starts to sound like a fixed mindset type of thing, like I can't learn this way, I only have to learn that way. Right. Okay, that's a good warning. Okay.
Yeah, so the way that I would suggest using this would be to identify a specific student or a few specific students that you're working with. You cannot do matching with an entire class period or even with a group. You're going to have to do matching with individual students depending on what you know about them. So you might take this document and sort of look at, with the student, especially since you're trying to coach them and help them be a part of this, to look at which elements of effective effort they might be having a hard time with and which types of learning, what type of learners they are that might be helpful to them.
Okay.
So, for example, if you have a student who is a visual learner who's struggling with focus, for example, then you might take a look at this element and say, which one of these things feels like it might make the most sense to you, or do you think you can try? And then you would give that a try. The other thing that I would say is that, like I said, you want to try multiple ones. So you might try a visual learning focus aspect and then maybe a kinesthetic or an auditory learning piece for either focus or maybe a study strategy.
Okay. I noticed that resources and there's one more, use of feedback isn't on here. So how come you chose commitment, time, focus, and strategies and didn't have the other ones on here as well?
Sure. Part of the reason for that is that I was trying to make this document as general as possible, and resources are going to be very, very specific to not only your subject matter, but your specific course. And so that would be something that you might want to include, either have the students generate it or you can provide it at the beginning of a lesson or a unit. And then what was the other
Use
one?
of feedback.
And the use of feedback is very much for the same reason,
Mhm.
because teachers give feedback very differently, and it might be more beneficial to do something more subject specific.
And it really looks like strategies is kind of the meat of this whole thing, which
Right.
makes sense as well.
And in some cases, feedback is written into some of the study strategies as well. So it's not separated out, but there are some pieces of it that are there.
Okay. Anything else you think people need to know before they jump in with this?
Yeah, the last thing that I just want to point out is I don't remember where I read it or who said it to me, but somebody once said to me, hope is not a strategy.
Mhm.
And I think for me, that's what really drives home this idea of knowing our students and using our relationships for learning, because we have to help our students figure out what specific strategies can they use, what specific skills and strengths do they have that are going to help them do better and learn more.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Viv. If you have any other questions, you know where to find us.